Considered as one of the most epic adventures in the franchise yet, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was a game that was a large and lengthy initiative by Nintendo EPD to develop. Following the pursuit of wanting to rethink the conventions of Zelda as a means to completely shake up the formula that was attached to the series for many years, Breath of the Wild saw many attempts to figuring out this riddle, from alien invasions to even Link in Kyoto and Ganon in the sky. But even once figured out, the game went through constant changes in developing its world and characters, including several dungeons that were cut, champions that were scrapped, and character designs that kept evolving over the course. Today, we shall explore the history and beta unused content of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. Our story today starts before our initial game was even conceived, with the entry just prior, Skyward Sword. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword had just released in 2011. While reception was overall positive in continuing much of the Zelda series' fine-tuned formula, it had received criticism for a variety of its features, a largely prominent complaint being how limited exploration was in the game, as much of the game was going through corridors to the next dungeon over and over. Series producer Eiji Onuma had taken notice of such a complaint. The urge to see and explore Hyrule was clear, and was something not truly ever explored in a 3D Zelda game, with how much of them were set to crawl between corridors to the next dungeon in order to progress the story. Games that came close to the idea were The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, which even then were rather limited due to the requirements of certain key items being found only in dungeons, preventing one from freely exploring. It was as such clear to Onuma that the team needed to rethink the conventions of Zelda. Rethinking the conventions was basically to hit the reset button in terms of everything Zelda gameplay, not just how one explores the overworld, but even the puzzles, dungeons, and even story progression. The team started to think of many ways to approach it, and many proposals were submitted. One involved Hyrule in an all-out war, another involved an older Link, complete with a mask, a beard, and armless, potentially an already battle-hardened Link, along with another design where Link's hand could transform into a variety of weapons, and even this interesting one of an island in the sky with Ganondorf on top of it. Both ideas of which the team may have considered when looking into a latter sequel, but even wackier ones were ones that included an alien invasion of Hyrule, one set in present time, with Link seen here in modern clothing, a motorcycle, and even a guitar. The accompanying comic for it even included a punk rock Ganondorf too, as well as one set even further in the future with Link in space, where he even encounters Metroids. And oddest of all being one where he would be in the real world, specifically in Kyoto, titled as Link in Kyoto. It was clear the team was very serious about changing up the Zelda series hard with how wild some of these ideas were, but the solution was a lot simpler than what was being tossed around. The director of this new Zelda game, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, looked back to the start of the series, Zelda 1, a game that lets you go anywhere and discover the game at your own pace. The inspiration was clear. A true open-world Zelda game was the answer. This new Zelda game was now being planned for the Wii U, and with the power of that console, it enabled the team to make that wish of exploration truer than ever by planning a huge open world. This was going to be the team's first crack at an open world game, something that was well known already in the market. For this, the team started to look at other popular games, including Shadow of the Colossus and Skyrim. Shadow of the Colossus especially sticking with them due to the climbing mechanics, though the creator of the game, Fumito Ueda, being friends with Eiji Onuma might have led him to give it a longer look too. The team started out by testing the game using a simple map of Link flying into Himeji Castle in Kyoto, which may or may not have been pulled from Google Earth, traversing its exterior and inner walls. What's to note is that Link even had a diving mechanic here in order to dive down faster, brought in straight from Skyward Sword, and something that was eventually cut, but an idea they would consider again when returning for a latter sequel too. The purpose of this seemingly being to test the distance between landmarks for what was to build ideas for the larger open world they had planned. But to better assist with the building of this open world, Nintendo-owned studio Monolith Soft was brought in to design it, Monolith Soft is of course well known for the well-designed and massive overworlds of the Xenoblade series. When starting to build the open world, the game's engine had to be made. For that, the team used the Havoc physics engine, which had famously been used for a plethora of different series, from Assassin's Creed, Monster Hunter World, Demon's Soul, and so much more, enabling the game to have realistic physics. However Link interacts with the world, the game would react. From cutting a tree and the tree falling on just the right angle, to setting a field on fire, to even being able to put multiple apples on a switch to open a gate instead of actually grabbing a block. Onuma in fact saw the engine as such a breakthrough for the series that he stated that it underpins everything in the world and has it function in a logical and realistic way. And to test these mechanics, the team went back to their original inspiration of the first Zelda by making a simplified map based on this new game with these 2D sprites. At the same time, incorporating in the game's engine for experimenting the physics with these sprites, from blowing fire around and having it spread, cut trees, and to logs naturally flowing down a stream while Link crosses it. A prototype for the game in a way. While going anywhere was a way to break the Zelda convention, one obstacle in the way were the game's barriers, walls. The idea, however, was easily remedied, and it was to let Link climb these very walls that would once block him, offering additional paths to his destination. Once up on top of these walls, jumping off and combining it with a glide was what the developers felt perfected the idea of exploration. While testing these new mechanics in this new open Hyrule, they had Link equipped with the double hookshot, based directly on the double claw shot of Twilight Princess. Being that almost anything was climbable, it allowed Link to move around in very much a Spider-Man-like fashion. However, it was clear that such a mechanic could break the game, so it was soon removed. But with the game taking place in such a large world, and Link being penned to be able to go anywhere, the team was determined to make the game non-linear, as to not keep the player on the set path and let them freely explore. To test this mechanic, Nintendo utilized the ability to tackle any dungeon in any order in the 3DS game, A Link Between Worlds. In that game, you would be able to buy or rent dungeon items in any order and tackle that very dungeon it's associated with. This was praised by fans and outlets. As such, it further emboldened the team with that approach. And so dungeon design was in full swing, with making mobile dungeons this time. A new take, and one that would take advantage of the large open world well. Initially, upwards of 10 dungeons based on animals were planned, which could nicely be snugged into every corner of Hyrule, including an elephant, 2 types of lizards, a camel, a bird, a dinosaur, a whale, a crab, a manta ray, and a jellyfish. However, by the end, this was cut down to 4. While no real reason was given for the cut down, it might have cluttered even this large Hyrule too much, let alone planning to tie each of these dungeons to one civilization, which would mean at least 10 civilizations would have to be made. In fact, from the get-go, the plan was to have a race indeed controlling each of these mobile dungeons, each one being a champion of their civilization, and using a unique weapon. From the start, a Gerudo, a Zora, and a Sheikah. The Sheikah had a hookshot-like weapon, possibly in relation to the one that Link had in development. However, the Sheikah was soon replaced by a Gerudo and given a short sword and shield. However, what is interesting is that they planned to use a Kokiri back then as one of the champions who would use a whip, a weapon that is not in the final game. Kokiri being here would have been the first grand return of them as a race since Ocarina of Time, but alas, the team decided to instead keep them as their small Korok forms and spread 900 of them across Hyrule in order to collect their seeds for slot upgrades and a questionable reward. And so instead we had the return of the Rito, taking the place of the Kokiri and using a bow. But with only 4 dungeons now planned, the elephant, the lizard, the bird, and camel all initially had rather grand designs that were eventually made into smaller, simplified designs, featuring much less rooms in comparison to what is seeable via the concept art here. But in addition to this, 120 mini dungeons were being made and scattered across the open world, titled as shrines, that gave you an orb upon completion, which could be exchanged for a heart piece or stamina. This being made as a way to fill up this rather large overworld, and give a real purpose to search around, a problem many open world games have actually, which leaves them feeling empty. Even non-open world games with large worlds like Twilight Princess face similar problems, which the shrines solve. The shrines themselves initially had a golden interior, and even contained writing on the wall in the final room, both of which changed by the final game. But while dungeons and civilizations have been crafted, one more race was being planned for the game, a race of small individuals known best as the Minish, from the game Minish Cap, were set to be there as well, and a piece of concept art even exists of Link visiting them. Eventually they were cut from development. Thus in the end, the final decided races boiled down to Hylians, Zoras, Gorons, Ritos, Gerudos, and Koroks. One cut race and one altered race. However, to tie the whole open world together, they were intending to take full advantage of the Wii U's capability and utilize the gamepad heavily, allowing one to see the whole map of Hyrule as they make their way to their destination that they mark on the map. But beyond that, it was to feature several touch mechanics too, all of which were to be tied to the in-game Sheikah Slate that Link carries that also mirrors the Wii U gamepad. These mechanics included the ability to solve game puzzles by making bombs, giving the ability for Link to have magnet gloves to move metal objects, which eventually changed to simply being able to move metal objects, creating pillars of ice, and putting objects and enemies in a temporary stasis. It originally even was fitted with a few other unique features, such as a dragonfly for spying around the general area, liquid cartridges to keep it charged, and the requirement for Link to physically pull it apart and twist it to turn on. However, many of these did complicate the features of this design, and so they were simplified. While none of the other Wii U exclusive features were confirmed, it can be speculated that some of these features might also have included item management, rune selection, and even picture taking with the built-in camera and gyro. And to tie it all together was the art style. The art style was decided based on trying to find the right balance based on the playability of the gameplay and how over the top it may appear, versus the reality of the gameplay and how well it blends into the game's world. Basically, how believable it visually appears to the player. For this, the team did several experiments to bring Zelda into the HD generation of gaming. The first test was of a tech demo that was presented at E3 2011, which resembled Twilight Princess, but was highly detailed and very realistic in appearance, featuring Link vs. Goma in the Temple of Time. But further experiments were done in taking what they learned here and took Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, and Wind Waker into an HD field with a new lighting system at play too. What stood out most was the Wind Waker's art style. This was described as an art style that is easy to lie with, as in the art style masks the over-the-top playability while still feeling like it belongs to this cel-shaded world. In this case, if one were to chop a tree, already tied up wood would appear, or if one tries to kill an animal, it would blow up into a puff of smoke and become a chunk of meat. And this would look fine in this art style, whereas in a realistic art style, it would appear too silly. As such, the cel-shaded graphics were indeed the answer for the series to return to, and even led to the HD port of The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker HD on the Wii U. However, even then, making a game that looks like Wind Waker still had problems of its own, of being too far removed from reality due to the super deformed chibi art style and the simplified world details. Something that wouldn't work well with the new engine that has the world interacting with itself. As such came the blend of models with a more realistic manga style, and a world filled with bright colors and style of cel shading while being more detailed overall. A compromise between the Wind Waker style and the Twilight Princess style to create a truly unified look that satisfied the balance of playability and the reality of the next generation Zelda game. But once the setting was decided upon being a medieval setting by tradition, one thing they wished to mix up was Link's design. The green tunic was just expected at this point, and so several iterations of Link were made. Some featuring the traditional tunic, some that mixed it up with a cloak, and the cloak definitely started to replace his traditional cap in many iterations following, until eventually coming to a design that was blue. According to Eiji Onuma, nobody on the team said, let's make him blue. It just organically ended up being that way. And so this was the new face of this fresh take on Zelda, and this design started to evolve too as development continued, with his gauntlets growing and becoming more detailed, the patterns on his tunic slowly changing into the shape of a sword, to soon even including a Sheikah slate on as a permanent addition. But of course, with Link comes Zelda. Unlike Link, who had designs that were still quite in line with what we know of a general look for Link, Zelda went through many varying designs. Some in a more generic princess outfit, reminiscent of her previous games, one with a more general civilian look too, also note the Sheikah slate in her hand, and two that had her looking like wildly different rich girls, and one that looked ready to adventure on a horse. There were two major contrasts here in design, one being a more general princess in a dress, the other being out and ready to adventure, and in the end, the team went with both styles. A design reflecting her formal wear, and as well a matching adventure costume for the intent of traveling out to research. But as well a third design with a simple white dress meant for training her powers. The same powers that were meant to be utilized for sealing the great calamity the game was being prepared for. But together with these two were 4 champions being made that were to be a symbol for each of the 4 main dungeons of the game, each coming from a specific race of Hyrule that grew and evolved over time. And to begin is with the Zora, who housed the champion Mipha. The Zora themselves started out looking rather different, 2 different races actually, one being the general grey Zoras we are used to at this point, and the other being these green ones that many may know best from A Link to the Past, called Zolas in the West, or River Zoras if you prefer. Potentially a rivalry was planned between both Zora races as part of a story element, but eventually coming to a design featuring a complete fish head on all of them, with many of them even being still clothed, both minimally and completely. This all being before they start to prefer nudity by the final game. And so we look closely at the champion Mipha herself, who initially could be said to have started out as this general sketch of a female Zora the team wanted to use, having the Zora crest over her head and body, but also wearing a cloak of sorts. The first official design followed, with her having several fins that came out of her body like a lionfish, that apparently would open up for combat at that, which would kinda defeat the purpose since they wished to design her as a spear user, and so they came to a much more simpler design that was clearly female in design, but also still needing a weapon for combat. However, Mipha also had family, starting with her brother Sidon, going through a blue and green iteration with one designed after a sturgeon fish and the other a hammerhead shark. Sticking to Mipha's design, the hammerhead made the most sense. Eventually, the team was comfortable with this neutral gray design, but soon the team realized a major flaw, and it was that he wouldn't be too noticeable in the dark and rainy Zora domain when Link first enters it. That and the design contrasted a lot with Mipha's red design, and so the team changed him up when modeling him in-game to a red color. King Dorephan being the father is next. He initially had 2 different designs, one resembling the fatter design of King Zora from Ocarina of Time, complete with an assistant who would keep him moisturized. The second is a more mobile design, even if still overweight, but looks more like an old veteran Zora warrior, complete with a coat he had then too. All coming to this giant white shark combo of the final game that made him far more muscular and truly deserving of being the king of Zoras. Moving on to Gorons, the Goron were more or less from the get-go designed with a design rather similar to their iteration from Ocarina of Time. Gorons in this iteration are shown in their most varied roles yet, with them wearing various headgear for their jobs, from miner, worker to warrior. However, some wackier ones were planned too, featuring some party headgear, which may have been a little out of place. But moving to the Goron champion Daruk, Daruk started with 2 initial designs, both seemingly meant from the get-go to show a warrior at his prime, an intentional design for being the leader of the Gorons. His first design was unhinged, with magma even flowing through him, having little hair but a large beard. The second design has him in much heavier armor instead, with a lot of hair but a smaller beard, and even had volcanoes on his shoulder. It was clear that these may have been a bit over-designed, so he was severely simplified by the final game, and now also given a lot of beard and hair to compensate. But another Goron did see an evolution in design, Daruk's very own descendant, Yunobo. Yunobo, being a descendant of Daruk, had his initial design in fact having Daruk's hair in a nice attention to detail, but over time he eventually was given more of a mohawk, standing to look more like a general Goron, but also unique enough to be his own character. After such a long while, the Rito were finally being brought back as a race. Unlike their iteration in The Wind Waker, the Rito were now more a collection of different birdmen. Going back to that original sketch, the Rito weren't even considered until the second iteration of the champion sketches, where they replaced the Kokiri as one of the 4 champions and were made from the get-go to use bows as their main weapon. In fact, the sketch of them had them using their feet to fire off arrows initially, before doubling their wings as hands. But along with that sketch, which had a similar birdman design, a later sketch was made that showed them dressed rather elegantly and wearing a hat too. Something the Rito lacked in the final game, where they dressed a lot more simply, which made sense considering being overdressed would get in the way of flight. And their champion Revali was no different, as he was at one point also very overdressed, full cloak and hat. Revali was being set up as a character that could be considered as sort of a rival to Link, and thus his design was being based around that entirely. His bow, however, was very unique in that it was in the shape of stringed instruments, which is a motif with the Rito that has stayed into the final game with how musical they are. Eventually, like with other champions and his race, Revali was also simplified to the strong but regal design he has in the final game, down to even the bow. The Gerudo were potentially introduced with the second set of champion sketches, when they replaced the Sheikah here with a Gerudo. There was also emphasis on trying to curl their hair more originally too, in comparison to a straight-haired Zelda, but otherwise the iconic red hair, mainly ponytailed, with stereotypical Arabic fashion, were planned right from the start. However, several designs did also exist of different variations of clothing, including a more belly dancer design too. Of course, the champion Gerudo did evolve eventually into the modern champion Urbosa. This was after looking like just another generic Gerudo. But of course, she'd blend in too well with everyone, so eventually she was given a much grander appearance, with much longer hair, but yet intentionally made to look more feminine to have a more motherly appearance, a representation of both a warrior and a motherly leader. Koroks were set to return again after their long absence since the Wind Waker. Originally, they were conceived as Kokiris, as seen in the original planned sketches of the champions. However, they were eventually made to be Koroks, and 900 of them were spread through Hyrule for Link to find and collect their seeds. Originally, their design was going to be a radical shift from their Wind Waker design, looking a lot leafier and with a wooden face instead, but they went with their design closer to their iconic Wind Waker design. A unique giant Korok was also made too this time, called Hestu, who is the person that would collect Korok seeds for an item slot upgrade. His design started out simply as a giant Korok, with little distinguishing features, even just simply holding a leaf. This all changed upon giving him actual tree branches and maracas by the end. While Kokiri were cut or altered, there is one truly cut race that was being planned, known as the Minish. The Minish were originally introduced in the game, the Minishka, and were set to appear in tiny villages in this game too. In this instance, Link was to shrink down and explore Minish villages similar to their introductory game. However, with already so many races in the game and with major characters that stood out, the team decided they would have to be cut. But of course, there were many other non-playable characters that were introduced throughout the game, from numerous Hylians to ones that weren't very human-looking even, including Kilton, a creature who was to buy and sell monster-related products to Link, originally being a traditional naked human hidden inside a large cart with all his gear, before becoming this creature with clothes and having a balloon and materials instead. Other prominent ones include the Bolson Construction Company and its flamboyant leader Bolson, who originally wasn't so flamboyant and much more of a rugged old man, a lot like the leader of the construction company in Ocarina of Time. Sage of the Koichi Dye Shop being another who had a rather different early design, looking a lot more colorful too compared to his final counterpart. Great Fairies were set to return too, and with designs that changed grandly. Unlike their final sexier design, the initial Great Fairy looked a lot chunkier and looking more like a Buddha-inspired figure, which their entire surrounding is even covered in gold. Speaking of the surroundings, the fairy fountains also had many designs planned, each very unique from one another, unlike the slight differences of the final game. The fourth, of course, being the horse-related one, Melania, which also appeared to look very different in planning, looking absolutely fabulous. A lot more in line with the other Great Fairies in fact, and not so ominous like the final game. Imagine this one giving you threats about your life. But possibly the most prominent race of this game were the Sheikah. The Sheikah were set to return, and this time as a much grander race like never seen before, instead of them either being hidden or nearly extinct. And this was because the story of the game was taking influence from the mysterious Jomon period of Japan, which the Sheikah were to be instrumental in also having a mysterious past in this game, while themselves being a very Japanese heavy influenced race to further be distinguished from others in game. And so they were expanded upon heavily this game with large ancient technologies of theirs spread throughout the game. The earliest sketch of the champion included a Sheikah instead, as evident by the faint eye seen here. Very different from a typical Sheikah too, having far more of a dress-like attire and with dark skin instead of their typical lighter skin. Strangest of all being the use of the hookshot to represent their race. The hookshot, however, would fit pretty well for a race of ninjas who could zip from place to place quickly with such a contraption. But being that this was the first major introduction as a race, a lot of thought was put into developing their designs, and eventually a set design was finalized for the tribe, including having an old woman on stilts to just general different clothing styles and proportions. Serious traditional characters such as Impa returned, along with new members such as Paya, and for the first time, male Sheikahs too. As such, we had a prominent character such as Robbie, who started out looking rather western in design and even had more hair all over the place, but evolved to have the traditional Sheikah design the game settled on. This was followed by another prominent Sheikah, Pura, who started out with a punk rock design and looking closer to a preteen before being aged down further and given a magical girl influenced design for the final game. But being that the Sheikah were said to be part of the very race that started ancient technologies, the 120 mini dungeons or shrines were also said to be part of the creation and design, and so each of these were fitted with an ancient Sheikah monk. On the flip side, the game even introduced a group of rogue Sheikah called the Yiga clan, dressed in all red, obsessed with bananas, and worship Calamity Ganon. Bringing us to the villains of the game. With there being such a large world this time, the enemies were said to be even more varied and scattered across the open world. The idea wasn't just to have enemies in spots for Link to fight, but for them to react to the world, from camping, cooking, eating, sleeping, and even looking up at the sky while it rains. And there were indeed a good variety that fit their various regions, from many forms of bokoblins, moblins, and Lizalfos, to even ones as mighty as Lionels, who may put the game's bosses to shame even. Lionels in this case were coming back for the first time since the series began, and with various forms at that. The large muscular design was clear from the get-go, but they appeared rather simple, but eventually with revisions received horns, more fur, and overall a lot more design to the menace of the final game. Wizrobes are also ones with various forms for each element, starting out with rather unique designs originally, from a witch, Poe, and jester looking design to looking like this robed wizard. Choo-choos were also another elemental monster for each region. There was going to even be plans for a form planned for this one where it would open up to have a giant eye in the middle in a rather horrendous fashion. And of course, a Zelda game isn't complete without keys, and this time also with elemental versions. In the planning stages here, they had an even more bat-looking design and a comically looking round mouth for attacking. This further extends to Octoroks, who now have both an offensive water form to a grounded stealth form, whereby they would have an item on their head but hidden underground to trick Link. One even included a duck, which was gone by the final game. But alas, further rougher looking designs were even planned too, before we got the rounder model of the final game. However, the major difference this time was that it wasn't just these regular enemies in the open world, but several boss monsters were set to appear too, with their very own HP bar at that. These include golems, such as the Stone Talus, as well as the rather popular Hinox also, which appears like a super bokoblin of sorts, and this beast had a massive amount of revisions he went through. The one-eye feature was very clear from the start, but details and even colors changed heavily as they went forward. In fact, he was even set to be a bigger menace by attacking civilians, animals, and just overall rather active. But that might have been a little overpowered, so eventually he was made to just constantly sleep until he hears Link nearby. And last of the field bosses being the Desert's Molduga, being a sort of a whale for being in the desert, originally having a more intricate tail and ears too, which even glowed in the dark. But soon it was simplified to more of a muted design for the final game. But along with the more prominent enemies of the game were the Guardians, a new set of enemies that were ancient and hazardous compared to anything else in the game. At first, they explored these with at least 4 organic-looking Guardians, alluding to plans for a darker Zelda, including a spider with many eyes, a giant enemy crab, a creature straight out of Doom, and Slenderman, all appearing to be massive next to Link. But then they decide on Mechanical Guardians, a brand new take on bringing futuristic looking enemies to the series, shrunk down to be closer to Link's size. Coming in various designs, at least 4 more were designed that were scrapped. The first is this one that looked like a direct predecessor to the final Guardian, but looking a lot rounder and monotone. The next one that looked similar to the final, but with many capacitors on its head. Then we got one that is covered in moss, but with a glowing disc on its head. But the most interesting one is this humanoid looking Guardian, looking a lot like a cut Twilight Princess enemy, capable of shooting its lasers from his chest, eventually settling down on a more simpler spider-like design, for the more general designs at least, aside from the turret and the Skywatcher variants of course. But while these races of Hyrule and enemies filled the fields of this massive new Hyrule, the dungeons themselves had their own unique bosses. The bosses of this game were all based on the main evil of the game, Calamity Ganon. Each of the 4 dungeons having what is known as a blight, which were essentially Phantom Ganon, much like the one from Ocarina of Time, made by Calamity Ganon to take control of the 4 divine beasts, each with a unique element and weapon type, while all sharing a black body and red hair, but overall different proportions from one another. However, the main villain himself, Calamity Ganon, had a massive journey to get to where he is today. Like Link, he shared a few concept arts for ideas, including a punk rock Ganondorf to accompany this Link, and even a version of Ganondorf in the sky. Eventually, they went with a less human and more malice form to Ganon this time around, given 3 forms to accompany it. A cocoon form to hold this form, an incomplete form when the cocoon hatches too early, and a true form in the form of Dark Beast Ganon, looking a lot more like the Beast Ganons we are familiar with. And originally it started out in a more flesh state in that form, by growing his malice around his body. This design further evolved to one that had him even upright like some of the more classic designs, but in the end they made him a true beast, making him purely from malice to make him the final boss of the game. Development was far and beyond. The game was now in the oven for several years, and what was being made was the largest Zelda game yet. During Breath of the Wild's development, the team had crafted a massive overworld with mobile dungeons that can be tackled in any order, using a realistic physics and chemical engine with a story and rich cast of characters to bind it all together, all under the development tag of breaking the conventions of Zelda. And the game was finally about to be shown off for the first time to the public. While the game had been in development for 3.5 years by June 2014, the public had only heard rumblings of a Zelda game for Nintendo's then console, the Wii U. The first mention of it happened at E3 2011, where General Manager Shigeru Miyamoto confirmed that there was a new Zelda game in development, while showing off a tech demo of a hyper-realistic Twilight Princess looking demo. Something that made fans uneasy on if they would stick to that look after the debacle that was Space World 2000, when Nintendo showed off a realistic looking tech demo only to reveal a cel-shaded game a year later, which producer Eiji Onuma quickly made clear that the demo is not what people should expect the game to look like. Which behind the scenes, the tech demo was simply an idea for a graphical style up to that point, but dropped in favor of a Twilight Princess and Wind Waker blend of art style to best represent the game's physics and world. Fast forward 2 years to January 2013, at a Wii U Direct, Onuma, who had now witnessed a confidently made engine in development, trickled further ideas about the game, including how it would continue to challenge the conventions of Zelda and let players tackle the game in any order. But the true reveal of the game came as of June 2014, Onuma now showcasing a massive cel-shaded Hyrule. If you could see it on screen, you could go to it, with this trailer completing with a new enemy called the Guardian chasing Link and Link fighting back with a mysterious new arrow. The gaming world quickly fell in love with it. Despite the series returning back to cel shading, fans loved the art style, loved the large world, and the newer concepts such as the futuristic looking arrow and mechanical enemy. In fact, the game was so beyond what anyone was expecting, some weren't even sure if this was Link, with how different he looked wearing that blue clothing and less rugged appearance, going as far as to think that this was in fact a female Link for a change. Something Eiji Onuma once again had to step in and clarify not to be the case. But shortly after, at Game Awards 2014, a further in-depth look of the game was shown off, with both Shigeru Miyamoto and Eiji Onuma at the helm of it, showing what was a well-developed but still very rough world in comparison to what was to come with the final game. While the general shape of the land was mostly there were still major land formations that were altered, such as the mountain pass being a lot less claustrophobic. These paths of trees being originally a lot more simplistic too, and not so varied. Going further, grass and trees in certain locations being either added later or removed. An entire Sheikah tower that wasn't there. Even a certain tower that existed early on was later removed. Ruin artifacts that hadn't been implemented yet. And runes that did exist were further evolved and changed by the final game, which in fact Miyamoto pointed out how the runes were a clue to a dungeon nearby. This being a clear hint to the upcoming mini-dungeons called shrines, where seeing such irregularities on maps could lead one to a shrine. In fact, the enemy placement in this area was completely different too, but the enemies of this demo did showcase the first set of combat on horseback with the bow, including a new technique of Link jumping off and shooting in slow motion at the enemy. What was pointed out is how the horse's AI had been built to now know to avoid obstacles on their own, much like a real horse would. The most interesting bit seen here is the inclusion of what appears to be a magic meter initially, which, if this was kept, would have been the third energy bar of the game, along with the hearts and the stamina meter. Either that, or this was just the stamina meter and how it looked back then. But the bigger point of interest here is how it was going to take advantage of the Wii U's power with the gamepad's touchscreen at your fingertips. It was set to clearly imitate the in-game Sheikah slate that Link would use. Therefore, when Link would use it to pin a point of interest, you'd move the gamepad like Link would move the Sheikah slate to do this. But on top of that, the map of Hyrule was right there on the gamepad at all times to be viewed on the fly, and with the ability to zoom in and out. A very handy tool without the need to pause the game in order to view the map, especially with how massive this map was set to be. But regardless of the fact, hype was through the roof for what was now the Wii U's killer app for a release in 2015, which Onuma confirmed once more in that demo. Something that wouldn't stay true, as one more teaser for the game was shown in November 2015, after a year of silence that confirmed that it was now coming out in 2016. Not so strange for Zelda games to get delayed, since that is pretty normal at this point with how development for these games usually evolves and expands. But 2016 was also not to be the case. One day at the offices of Nintendo EPD, an ominous email was sent by Eiji Onuma regarding Nintendo's next platform, the Nintendo Switch. And it was a simple email with a tall order of making this very Zelda game on the Wii U cross-platform with the Nintendo Switch, and on launch day at that, on March 2017. At first, this prospect frightened the team, as porting a game usually involves a lot of technical adjustments for it to function. However, what Nintendo provided was a very easy to work with development kit, whereby not only did it make it easy to port a game to the Switch, but without even optimizing the game, it was running perfectly and in fact at a higher frame rate at that. What could have easily jeopardized the production if it was on any other console ended up making this now the perfect launch title instead for the next platform. However, being that this was going to be on the new Nintendo Switch, the team wanted the games to function identically. Therefore, giving the Wii U an exclusive advantage of the gamepad and all its functionality wasn't going to fly. In fact, the team initially even wanted to feature Switch exclusive features too, but with the idea of keeping them identical, that was scrapped too. But it didn't take long for the team to soon notice that simply being on the Switch was already enabling it to take advantage of the system's gimmicks. The idea that the developers had been building towards was freedom with this game, to play it any way you wish, explore anywhere, tackle the story in any order, build your own path. Now with the Switch, this freedom automatically extended it to real life. The very fact that every game could be played portably already gave the game a sense of freedom to choose how you wish to play it. Top that off with the freeform factor of the Joy-Cons and how you wish to hold and play the game with them, including holding them with your arms crossed. Along with some polish to the graphics and sound quality of the Switch version, these along with the system's gimmicks made it worthy of showcasing it as a Switch launch title now. And so development continued, with a clear date, platform, and pathway forward for the game. At this point, it was heavily around polishing and refining the game to launch. Of course, with the Switch now at play, the whole map system and any exclusive functionality of the Wii U gamepad was now being implemented into the game itself, with a combination of buttons to pop open the map menus and other related gamepad features, to using the Switch's gyro controls to imitate the gamepad's movements. As well, numerous characters started to resemble their final incarnations too. This as well as dungeons were being given their final design and polish, with some such as Va Nuburus initially having larger malice effects. But beyond that, the game's world was evolving. Many of the places that looked one way in concept were coming to life and changing appearance grandly. These include everything from the Great Deku Tree, who went through numerous phases and different branches, to many interior designs of the Great Deku Tree grandly changing, much of which was designed more in a residence manner for the Koroks, as opposed to being shops like in the final game. Speaking of Koroks, early in development, the game had a numerous amount of these placeholder pedestals pulled straight from Skyward Sword all over the map, whereby Link would go and collect an item from them. These pedestals were now evolving into the returning race of Koroks, who would give Link seeds that can be exchanged for weapon slot upgrades. Kakariko Village, which initially had at least two major design changes, was finalizing. One with a simple lowland, wood-heavy hut design, eventually coming closer to its Japanese look, but still in a very different layout. In fact, while coming to its final state, many details evolved, including the interior of Impa's home growing more claustrophobic. The frog statues in the village even had many designs considered for it. The sister town to it, Hateno Village, even had two radically different designs too, both initially being planned as farming villages from the get-go, and only growing more complex until the final design they went with for the game. Akala Ancient Tech Lab, ran by Robbie, went through two designs, one with a more Sheikah tech-heavy design to it, almost looking dragon-like in appearance, the other looking more like a fortress, but with a tamed guardian that would greet you with a smiley face after removing its head. But weirder was how Robbie's ancient oven, Sherry, had a robot female Sheikah on its head originally that would move and speak to you. Well, this explains why his wife hated it. Terrytown, while not too different, had two very unsettling statues of Hudson himself at one point, near the entrance. The Zora domain especially went through several stages of planning, starting out in a more cavern-looking manner like an Ocarina of Time, before coming closer to the final game's appearance with an even more fortress-like appearance compared to the final games. Goron City started out quite simplistic in design, being like with the Zoras, appearing more like an Ocarina of Time where they had cave huts to live in, but also a massive minecart system running through the city. That and the 4 Hokages of Goron City being plastered on its mountain. This all evolving to being a bustling city with actual houses and traffic. Rito Village had 4 initial designs in fact, all of which made height a major factor for bird creatures to fly around. The first had a more elegant design to it, something that would have fit well with the elegant designs of the Rito then, having huts going from the bottom to top, hanging off trees like bird cages, along with an active windmill, likely to give them wind for flight. Another was a wildly different and not so mountainous one, but still retained a massive windmill design. The next two, however, did start to simplify and appear more stone-like, much like the final game. But eventually, by the final game, it was completely redesigned, and with the addition of the Divine Beast at the very top, to give it one very distinguishing look. Gerudo Town was surprisingly not too different from its final incarnation, save for the central structure, having one that was just a large building originally, to a massive gate, before coming to the three fountain designs of the final game. The map was also smaller initially, and had a different water pathway too. Eventually, it was expanded by quite a bit for the final game. However, Riju's room was going to be very childlike originally, with plushies of sand seals and bright colors everywhere. Clearly, they were gonna double down on her being a child here. Unlike the other towns of the game that greatly expanded, Lurlin Village was initially going to be a grand fishing village with several ports and a complicated design, before it was shrunk down for the final game. The many runes that were seen in the 2014 trailer were starting to resemble their final incarnations, which initially many more different runes were considered, including this nifty leftover cannon. Going further with the ruins, the statue in Farron Forest went through several designs before coming to what we see in the final game. And speaking of evolving exteriors since 2014, Dueling Peaks was going to have a simpler, more climbable design compared to what we got by the end. The stables, while not evolving too much for the final game, had the horse head change a good deal, looking less and less like a detailed horse. The many Zonai towers in the game started out with plans to make them much taller, more detailed, and with a special dragon head before being simplified. The head especially being of key importance that the team would return to in an eventual sequel. With this being such a grand leap for the series, one that breaks all conventions, even the story and presentation weren't going to be tackled differently. Unlike the usual hero's journey that Link goes through to save Hyrule that is on the verge of falling, or fallen midway through, this time it is of a post-apocalyptic Hyrule. Hyrule was set to be destroyed by a calamity, and Link would wake up 100 years after losing everything to start over and bring peace to Hyrule. With this change, cutscenes were being planned to showcase what happened, and for that, the presentation of the game was about to change with the first ever inclusion of full voice acting for such scenes. Link would remain silent, but everyone else would talk. Onuma, when he first heard someone talking in the series for the first time, was quite moved, and wished for everyone to feel that. And so voice actors were hired for 8 languages, as this was going to now be a worldwide same-day release. The music was going to take a very different approach this time as well. Unlike prior Zeldas with grand musical symphonies booming through any area, this game was going to focus on much more ambient tracks to calmly let the player explore the world and add a certain authenticity to the environment of the game. Music and environments have been in a hand-in-hand approach since Ocarina of Time, when Miyamoto challenged Koji Kondo to make ambient music for dungeons to the point where one could even taste the dungeon with that music. This concept now being taken into the overworld even. As development was winding down, Nintendo officially showed off the latest version of the game at E3 2016, a trailer that showcased a culmination of the team's efforts. From the grand and varied world, the ability to climb and explore anywhere, the post-apocalyptic story, and on top of that, the subtitle of the game, Breath of the Wild. A fitting name considering how the game was about exploring and feeling the wild for the first time in the series. If the trailer in 2014 made people feel hyped, this took it to a whole other level with all that was shown off. As such, it won many awards as the best game of E3 that year. With launch approaching, several editions were being pushed for the Switch edition, a limited and Master Edition bundle. The special edition included a Sheikah Eye coin, a tapestry of the world map, a music CD, and a Sheikah Slate Switch case. The Master Edition, however, had all of that, but also with a special Master Sword statue, a sword that Eiji Onuma even posed with prior to launch. In addition, a lineup of amiibos were being made for the game too. These would be used in conjunction with the game to receive various treasure chests that contain random items. As well, previous Zelda amiibos were being made compatible to unlock not only their respective game-exclusive costumes and Epona, but also the Wolf Link amiibo allowed one to summon Wolf Link to accompany Link 2. And so the game finally released on March 3rd, 2017 on both the Nintendo Switch and the Wii U. This being marked as the final game on the Wii U here. A grand way for the console to go out, selling an instant 1.5 million units in just a week, with 75% of those sales being solely on the Switch. A testament to now truly being a system seller, and the game that already was the Switch's killer app, despite being a cross-platform game. The reviews were also phenomenal, attaining perfect or near perfect scores across the board, and becoming 2017's highest rated game on Metacritic. Reviewers praised its open world design, and how freeform it was, many feeling that while it felt completely fresh, it still felt like Zelda 2, topping that off with how it truly broke the genre open and reinvented it. These being opinions that were also shared with the consumers. The Zelda team had truly accomplished what they had set out to do in creating a free-form open-world game that challenged the conventions of Zelda successfully. While Breath of the Wild was being enjoyed by the masses after having a lengthy and constantly evolving development, there were still many pieces to its development that remain questionable to this day. These being leftover content found within the game's data that points to bigger gameplay and story content that may have been cut out. The first piece is the single screenshot found here of Link, dressed in the game's Hero of the Wild outfit in front of Zelda in what is probably a flashback cutscene, doing what may be a ninjutsu spell. A very strange shot, as none of this makes sense from a final game standpoint. Outside of the Hero of the Wild outfit being in a beta form here, it could be theorized that initially Link was wearing this outfit in the past in a sort of classical adventure he was on, and thus looking the parts like in previous Zelda games, before the calamity hit and now wore the blue tunic we know. No idea of the ninjutsu spell though, but maybe it was training by the Sheikah here, who do use it after all, and Link may have been learning here? Another leftover piece is an unseen piece of dialogue from the goddess statue. If you have both your heart containers and stamina bar full, you get a message that you can't increase it any further. This being impossible to see, as you can't fill both meters completely. It is possible that this was going to be something you could do, but was dropped. Either that, or this was done as to not have the game crash if someone does manage it via a glitch. There were also several images for the Hyrule Compendium, which cover photos of enemies, items, and animals within it. 6 of which belong to large choo-choos, which normally don't have their own exclusive slot, as they are just read as just the same as their small variant, likely simplified for ease. A picture of Epona also exists, which the final game had no slot for, this likely being removed due to the amiibo functionality required to get Epona in the first place. An interesting one, however, being this picture of this Korok in Kakariko Village. Something that can't be done in the final game for the compendium. As the compendium allows you to track what has been entered into it, it is possible that the intention was to use a Korok image to track Koroks in the game, a feature that might have been considered for a later development. Otherwise, there were some beta fishes here too in the compendium. A potential cut item also exists in the game in the form of ice cream. There is a Soul ice cream graphic found in the data that acts to replace any corrupt graphic in the menu if the game glitches. It is possible that there was an ice cream recipe planned at one point, but was removed because, well, I don't think you can cook ice cream. However, the biggest mystery in all of this surrounds the sword that seals the darkness, the Master Sword. Within the game, the Master Sword is the only weapon that can't be permanently broken nor dropped. However, there is evidence to say that this may not have always been the case. The first of which is the broken Master Sword as a standalone item that you can equip. Normally, when the Master Sword loses its power, it becomes simply unusable. But here, we have a variation of the sword that only has its power at 1. It is unfinished, however, as despite what it says on screen, it still delivers the same damage as the regular Master Sword. Of course, the concept for the broken Master Sword at 1 damage and equipable was something Nintendo would again return to in a sequel. The other bit on the sword, however, is that it was possible to drop the Master Sword. If one were to glitch the game and actually drop the Master Sword, a special message plays that says the Master Sword has returned to the forest. Which following that, the Master Sword flies to the sky and disappears. In this instance, it's clear that one would have to venture all the way back to the Lost Woods just to lift it up and take it again. It's pretty clear why this mechanic was taken out of the game in the end. But the Breath of the Wild story didn't end with the release of the game. With the game selling a ludicrous amount of copies along with Switch hardware, Nintendo still had further plans with it, this being in the form of downloadable content. A second for the series actually, if one counts BS Zelda on the Satellaview receiving story patches. This was going to be in the form of 2 expansion passes, the Master Trials and the Champion's Ballad. Releasing only a few months after the game's launch, the Master Trials released in June 2017, which added the level gauntlet of the Trial of the Sword, where Link goes through several floors of enemies with literally no gear to start, all for a reward of powering up the Master Sword to twice its strength. But on top of that came Master Mode, a hard mode for the game that would truly challenge the best of Breath of the Wild players, coming with enemies that were swapped out for a stronger and smarter variation of themselves, a new gold variation too at that, and their ability to regenerate health. That and platforms held up by balloons containing enemies with treasure chests that were spread out throughout the whole game. Otherwise, other various additions were made, including the Hero's Path that tracks where Link has traveled in the game, the Travel Medallion that lets you make a warp point anywhere, and the Korok Mask that alerts you when you are near a Korok, a potential carryover from the Korok slot that was cut from the compendium. But the real meat of the DLC came from the Champion's Ballad. This added a whole additional story and dungeon to the game, taking the idea of Link receiving his own divine beast as the story, whereby Link has to go through several new shrines in various locations of the game, at the start of which Link begins with a temporary new item called the One-Hit Obliterator, which, as the name states, kills everything in one hit. While it looks like a short spear that works like a sword in the final game, it had a more sword-like appearance in the planning stages in fact. But the second DLC would also bring rematches with the Blights, using a set of items that are given to you, before tackling the new 5th dungeon of the game, with a Sheikah Monk as the final boss. All of this being done while being shown new cutscenes involving the 4 champions of the game when they first met Zelda and were being recruited into the rank of champions. The reward for all this being the Master Cycle 0, which while it has a horse-like structure that is fitting of Link, it initially had a wolf appearance as a concept too. Also fitting considering a previous iteration. To summon it, it would just phase into reality normally. But originally, Link in fact was going to hold a Sheikah ball of sorts that when tossed on the ground would turn into the bike. But with this, one can summon it almost literally anywhere and do maneuvers that would be otherwise impossible on horseback. A truly worthy reward for such a lengthy quest. While this would be a solid place to end the DLC, and is in fact seen by many as exactly that, the team did in fact have plans for at least one more piece of DLC. While the Champion's Ballad explored the past, this 3rd DLC was to explore the future, continuing off from the ending of the game where Link and Zelda went off to rebuild Hyrule. This time being about finding Ganondorf, who was sealed off at the bottom of Hyrule Castle, but comes alive and raises the castle to the sky, potentially reviving an old concept art from the initial planning stages of the game where Ganondorf was on top of a large floating island in the sky. But as Eiji Onuma puts it, when it comes down to technical things, DLC is pretty much data. You're adding data to a pre-existing game, and so when we wanted to add bigger changes, DLC is not enough, and that's why we thought maybe a sequel would be a good fit. And so this 3rd DLC was cancelled, and instead promoted and severely expanded upon for an upcoming sequel. As the years went by, Breath of the Wild's legend was forged, becoming the best-selling game in the franchise, sitting at over 30 million sales on the Switch, becoming the 4th best-selling Switch game at that, winning several gaming awards too, and considered by many the best game of all time too. While most do enjoy the game, there were of course some who had felt the game was too different from a standard Zelda game too. However, the Zelda team at this point felt very confident with what they had created, and wished to keep pushing forward with this new open and explorable Zelda formula for the foreseeable future. As such, the third cancelled DLC was turned into a full-blown sequel called The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, a game that proved how hot the series has gotten with the legacy that Breath of the Wild forged, and also a game that I plan to cover eventually. So hit the subscribe button, for I plan to be back with more Zelda and other games cut content and history soon. Hit the like button and comment below on if you enjoyed the final product of the game, or if you wish any of the beta material stayed in the final game. So everyone, thank you for watching!